I have spent my life making myself ready for this person and finding this perfect person. And I found my quote unquote soulmate. I found the one who completes me. So if I've done all that time and all that work, and then I finally find you and yet cheat on me, it's like, holy moly, now we're in a crisis. We're in this existential crisis because I don't know who I am anymore because I built my life around finding you. And then I found you and then you screwed around on me.
Hey everyone, I'm Meredith Shirey. I'm a licensed psychotherapist specializing in relationship issues.
And I'm Isaiah Vallejo-Justi, a divorce attorney.
This is a podcast about filling in the gaps of our relationships, the deeply personal choices we make for our families and ourselves,
and the impact our actions have on the rest of our lives. This is Love Me or Leave Me.
Hey everyone, welcome back. On our last episode, we were talking about sex, and we wanted to continue that conversation with a topic that probably sounds like it's pretty black and white, a cut and dry thing. But what we want to do is open this up in a way where hopefully this can give us a new way of talking about it, right? Changing the narrative and changing the lens a little bit. So we're actually going to be talking about monogamy, what it is, what it isn't, and maybe what it means in today's world, because the term probably needs a little refreshing in our mental dictionaries. So because this is a very multifaceted topic and that can be very emotionally charged and have a lot of moral underpinnings for people, we might not always agree, but this is also why it's important, because one of the best things about Isaiah and I's relationship is how different we are, because our differences are not a pain point. They're not weaknesses. They're actually our strengths. And it's one of the things that we both love about our professional relationship the most. And so even if we don't agree on things, or if we have different sides of it, we want to see that as part of a holistic conversation. So when you think of the word monogamy, what comes to mind?
I think it's kind of the ideal that kind of society traditionally has, where you're in a relationship with one person for the rest of your life. That's what I think when I think of monogamy anyway.
That very much reflects the more quote unquote traditional view of monogamy, or how historically it has looked, because even marriage was meant to be a monogamous relationship. But even the idea of what marriage is, that's actually taken quite a bit of evolution over time. So originally it was an economic arrangement. It wasn't meant to be romantic. And it was around the Industrial Revolution where we started saying, no, we want to have love matches. We don't want to just have to get married for lands and titles. And the same thing with monogamy. It used to mean one person for life, but now we think it to mean one person at a time.
Because especially nowadays where you can get divorced. So obviously you can be in multiple monogamous relationships throughout your lifetime. And, it's funny that you say economic partnerships. Marriages are still viewed as economic partnerships, but just mostly in divorce. I don't know if during the marriage itself, people think of it like that, but in divorce, it's absolutely like that.
There is almost that traditional view of it in that way, where you're looking at it economically and in fairness in the dividing up and the splitting up. So maybe if people actually took the more old school way of looking at it, getting into marriage, maybe divorce would actually take a turn. What do you think?
That could definitely be the truth, because it is an economic partnership. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that because your spouse is your economic partner legally. So people realizing that, probably a good thing. When it comes to monogamy itself, I think we should ask ourselves, is monogamy even a natural thing for human beings to want to have monogamous relationships?
There's one side of the evolutionary argument for monogamy that says that humans as a social bonding species who have typically bonded in pairs, that was actually very advantageous for us, that we were able to create more trust, share more resources, and then we were actually able to flourish more because of this pair bonding. Now, the other side of that, though, because of advances in medicine, people tend to have a much longer lifespan. So are we really supposed to stay with the same person for 60, 70 years? Yes, there are a lot of evolutionary advantages to being in the pair bonding, but that really only lasts for about 5 to 7 years. So basically the viability of how long it would take to raise a child to be able to feed and care for themselves. I think you can argue it both ways if it's quote unquote natural. I think that, to your point, we've been socially setting it up to be the quote unquote norm, especially if you're in a committed relationship or like a more traditional legalized relationship like a marriage. But, I think it is interesting because, especially in today's world, the ideas of non-monogamy and alternatives to traditional monogamy have really been at the forefront, especially in the dating world and when people are exploring relationships. And I've seen this actually happen with couples a lot, and it's so interesting to watch that be navigated.
I think the 60 to 70-year marriage is definitely still the kind of ideal, but is it the norm? I mean, I don't even know if we can say that's the norm anymore. If 50% of marriages break apart and not everybody gets married anymore. So I don't know if we can really say that it's the norm anymore. What does it mean to be monogamous? What does it mean to be non-monogamous? What does that look like?
There are so many different versions of this. And there's the difference between if you are in a mostly monogamous relationship that's quote unquote open, or what I think the kids are calling these days consensual non-monogamy. So consensual non-monogamy, my understanding of it is that basically you have your primary partner, but then you are both open to having other sexual partners, with the general understanding being that you shouldn't be forming emotional attachments to these outside people. But again, there are a lot of nuances to that, and there's a lot of ebb and flow, because is it possible to have sex with other people and not develop an emotional attachment? I don't know. So then there's polyamory versus polygamy. And polyamory is the idea that you have multiple relationships. So it's not just that you have this primary partner and you can have sexual relationships with other people, but you can have completely separate other relationships simultaneously. And not that the other people are involved necessarily, but they all do know of one another. This isn't something that's shrouded in secrecy.
I definitely have seen people have those types of relationships and to various degrees of success. As people go into longer term relationships and longer term marriages, there are times where perhaps one spouse tells the other spouse that, hey, you can do this if you want to do that. Sometimes, I think probably more often than not, it's not necessarily consensual. And I know we're going to talk about that in the next episode when it comes to infidelity. But when it comes to consensual non-monogamy, definitely have seen that. It seems to work for some and probably not work for others. I don't know what you've seen on your couch, Meredith, as to how consensual non-monogamy has impacted relationships.
I think it's hard to say one way or another if it makes you more or less likely to continue the relationship. What I do know and what I have seen, though, is that it requires so much egalitarianism and respect for one another, openness and vulnerability, and flexibility, the most flexible. So I think that those are the things that tend to trip people up. And so if they were to end things, it's because the thing is too, right, that what our monogamy agreement right now might not look that way in another couple weeks. So we're talking about the idea of, if you're consensually non-monogamous and your general agreement is that we're allowed to have sex with other people, but we are not supposed to form an emotional attachment. So what happens then if one of us does form an emotional attachment? Are we required to end that relationship and become strictly monogamous again? Are we allowed to open it up more and for it to be more of a polyamorous relationship? I don't know. And that's where the flexibility comes in. And I think that's where a lot of people have more trouble managing it and navigating it, because of just the level of communication it takes.
I know I'm the attorney here, right? And I'm the one who's supposed to be all for agreements. I don't know if it's necessarily possible for you to enter into that type of an agreement and say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. And then you're going to come back to the agreement and say, well, this is what we agreed to. And you've broken that. Now that means we have to break up. Like, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think if the two people want to try to make it work, they can, and they can revisit maybe some of their choices and maybe come together on a new agreement. And maybe they sit on your couch to do that, or maybe not, right? If it's too far gone at that point, then it's too far gone. And then there's options to kind of end the relationship at that point. I know that's completely different than polyamory and polygamy, which are not the same things. How do you think that this could last in the long term? Do you think that these type of relationships can last a lifetime?
I think that it really depends on the people in these relationships, and it is entirely dependent on their dynamics and their ability to be flexible with one another. Because, like you were saying before, this idea of breaking an agreement, yeah, if these people going into this open relationship think of it like the 10 commandments that are set in stone, that will break up very, very quickly because, again, you have to be so malleable. You almost have to think about like clay that never ever dries, right? You're constantly molding and shaping and reshaping. And I think that if you have two people who their dynamic, something about their dynamic works so much that they value each other and the connection enough to have that kind of flexibility, I think anything's possible. Now, is that the case for most people? No, because also people in non-monogamous relationships do cheat, right? Because if you break the agreement in any way, or if I feel betrayed, then that's infidelity. And again, we're going to get way more into infidelity in the next episode because that's also a much more complicated topic than we probably give it credence for. But the point is that it can work, but there are a lot of complications. And I think most people tend to not want to have the kind of flexibility it would require to make that non-monogamous relationship work long term. At the same time, the other side of it, I heard about this fascinating study where they were looking at the outcomes of child adjustment from polyamorous families. And I think people had this idea that they would have had poor adjustment outcomes because of these non-traditional relationships with the parents. But because there were so many more children involved in loving these children and caring for them and helping to raise them, they actually had much better adjustments. So the idea that it takes a village, you know, it's the idea of not putting so much pressure just on these two parents, but actually giving them a whole network of people. And so from that standpoint, they actually had much healthier adjustments. So, fewer instances of anxiety, depression, behavioral issues, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read that study and to see how long the study followed the individuals for, if they followed the children through adulthood or not. Because I think at the end of the day, as a parent, you don't necessarily want to create a well-adjusted 7-year-old. You want to create a well-adjusted adult.
That's very true.
When we look at child studies, really adult studies are kind of where we need to see how the children progress through time. Many polyamorous families are looking to become legally accepted, and that has led to a lot of complications in the law. So you have places like California that has a third parent law. New York has some case law on it as well. But what happens is that the case law is jumbled. There's no definitive answer yet from the Court of Appeals, at least not from what I've seen. What the courts are kind of saying is that maybe yes and maybe no, depending on where you are. And then what if you move? If you live in a state that recognizes your legal rights and you move to a different state, well, what happens to your legal rights? And those are the kind of things that we have to look to shore up depending upon what we're doing. So if we have a polyamorous family that has children, obviously they're going to want to make sure that all of them have rights to the kid or to the children. And then that presents the problems of what happens if there's a breakup. Are we splitting the time 3 ways or 4 ways? These are things that really have to be thought out. What happens with child support? What happens with property rights and all different types of things?
Is there even a way then to have a polyamorous family in the legal sense? Because I thought that polygamy, meaning like marriage, like legal marriage of more than one person at one time, wasn't legal in the US.
That's true. Polygamy is illegal. Is it possible? It's possible. It's happening. It's absolutely happening within the United States.
So wait, so you can have a polyamorous family and not be in a polygamous marriage?
Yes, because usually only 2 of the people are married. From what I've read anyway. So from what I've read, there are a bunch of cases where there's 2 people who are married and then another person joins the relationship. And there have been certain cases where that's recognized. I mean, there was a couple that I read about where all 3 people were allowed to be on the birth certificate. I'm not sure, however, because birth certificates don't always enable parental rights. So I'm not sure how that would be interpreted in the event of a breakup. But one way that becomes very important is what happens if there's a death. Let's say one of the parties dies or 2 of the parties dies. There's only one parent left. That's not the parent that's quote unquote recognized. You may have the child end up in foster care or end up with some distant relative that he or she doesn't know.
Oh, wow.
So these are some of the outcomes that you really kind of have to prepare for if you're in this type of relationship. Really need to make sure that your healthcare practices are right, your wills are right. Everything has to kind of reflect what it is that you want if you're going to do this, because you can have various negative effects that you didn't necessarily prepare for. And that can have negative effects upon your partners, but also upon your children. So you need to make sure that you have that kind of stuff worked out, because the legal system in and of itself, in my opinion, is not there yet.
Again, one of the differences that is a strength between us, right? So you're married and you have 2 children. I'm not married and I don't have children. So it makes sense that in some ways too, we're going to think about this differently, because I'm not necessarily thinking about this from the lens of bringing my family. Whereas I think for you, it becomes much more complicated because you're inextricably connected from your children.
But also as an attorney and somebody who divorces people for a living. So I come into a situation where something is ending. And now we're going to talk about people's rights. So the minute I see things like that, my mind goes to, okay, well, how can those people protect themselves? Because if they move out of state, so if they're in California, they have legal status, and they move to, let's say, I don't know, any other state that they won't have legal status, then how does that break down in their marriage? And what happens if there's a breakup? And how are they going to see each other? What happens if they get sick and they want to go see their spouse in the hospital and they can't? Or who's making the health decisions if there's no healthcare proxy? There's so many things that can happen negatively if these types of relationships rather aren't set up in a quote unquote legal manner.
Do you have any ideas or opinions on, should people start out opening the relationship, or could they start monogamous and then move to non-monogamous?
I think there are certainly people who start like that, and certain people who evolve to that, and certain people who don't want that at all. And I think that you have to figure out what it is with your partner that you want to do. You can consider your internal matters of what your belief structure is, what your faith is, and then come to a conclusion. If you're going to go from, let's say, a monogamous relationship, quote unquote, to a non-monogamous type of relationship, I think you better be ready to get negative feedback. I'll tell you that, one of the big reasons people get divorced, and again, we'll talk about this in the next episode, revolves around issues of infidelity. And a lot of these type of issues are transitioning from a monogamous to a non-monogamous relationship may be viewed as issues of infidelity when it comes to the person who's receiving that new information.
And I think this is a really big line to draw here too, is that when we're talking about consensual non-monogamy, we're separating that entirely from infidelity, because we're basically talking about the difference between privacy and secrecy. And I think we had mentioned that a little bit in the last episode. Infidelity is shrouded in secrecy. That is where you're not being honest, you're not being forthcoming, and you're not allowing your partner to be part of the conversation or the decision. Non-monogamy is entirely different, where you have both come to the decision and the agreement on this, and that both people are aware and are entitled to whatever information they want about this. You would probably give up a little bit of privacy, but again, for the idea that I'm respecting my partner's wishes, because we want to avoid the secrecy. And the secrecy, again, is where that really crosses into infidelity. I have seen people who bring up non-monogamy to their partner, and it feels very threatening to their partner, because when we moved to marriage being a romance, made it a love match, where I have spent my life making myself ready for this person and finding this perfect person, and I found my quote unquote soulmate. I found the one who completes me. So if I've done all that time and all that work, and then I finally find you and yet cheat on me, it's like, holy moly, now we're in a crisis. We're in this existential crisis because I don't know who I am anymore, because I built my life around finding you, and then I found you, and then you screwed around on me. So you see how like that can get so slippery so quickly. The idea of consensual non-monogamy is more of a nuanced way of saying, okay, if we can't necessarily expect total sexual fidelity, is there still a way to preserve the relationship where we don't have to go through that crisis? I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't know that either. I think you have to ask each individual kind of couple, and that's like a individual couple basis to decide whether or not that's something that they could do. I could see people being okay with that. So, people who have been okay with that. And I could see the flip side of that as well. What I'm saying is that conversation needs to be handled very delicately, because those type of conversation can lead to the ending of relationships. So we just have to be careful in that regard.
And it's not for everybody. And that's why, again, it takes so much flexibility to make this work, because if one person wants it and the other doesn't, it doesn't happen, right? You have to have both people who are entirely on board, and a very egalitarian and a very, very open and transparent way of looking at this, where you value the relationship so much that maybe this other part isn't as important. Here's some times when I've actually seen this work in a really interesting way. If you've had a couple who've been together for a very, very long time, and as we get older, especially if we've been with someone for 30, 40 years, it's natural that our sex life over time is going to probably decline a little bit. We're not going to have as much sexual interest as we once did, due to age, or again, due to just our history with this person. Who knows? We might care about them very, very deeply. And so if we have such a wonderful partnership, but maybe we don't connect sexually anymore. And then when we don't connect sexually, that creates all these fights and issues of conflict and stress on our relationship. If we could both say, if there's a different way to mediate this, where we can preserve our wonderful relationship and then also eliminate that conflict because we're now not picking on each other for that, maybe there's an option here. And that's where I think you can see it actually working very positively. But again, even then, there's a honeymoon phase where as soon as things change, as soon as one person isn't feeling okay, you have to be very, very attentive and flexible and make sure that the person who's feeling threatened or feeling less sure about this arrangement can feel good and comfortable and secure again. And so whatever accommodations you need to do to give them back that place of security, that's what it takes to preserve the relationship. And I think that's why, to your point, when we see it not working, it's because that is such a tricky balancing act and tightrope to walk that it's hard for people to maintain that over time.
So that's why it's a good thing that our next episode is about infidelity, because you can see how the issues regarding monogamy and what monogamy means can sometimes overlap or transition into issues regarding infidelity and cheating on your partner. So I think, at least my takeaway from this episode is one of open-mindedness, because we live in a very open world where we are now like gathering all this different type of information in different ways, and our thoughts are expanding and at an exponential pace. I think the idea is to just continue in our relationships honestly and be honest in our communications and kind of see where the future takes us.
Love Me or Leave Me is a podcast production of the Board brand. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical or legal advice and is not a substitute for professional consultation, diagnoses, or treatment. Always follow up with a licensed attorney or healthcare professional who can address your specific needs. Thanks for listening.